The Montana winter of 1877 gripped the land in a silent, icy fist. Ezra Kane knew this silence well. It was a part of him, a heavy cloak he'd worn for 5 long years. His small log cabin, tucked deep within the snow-laden pines, was as quiet as a tomb. No friendly greetings, no shared laughter, just the creak of old timbers and the whisper of the wind against the frosted glass. Ezra moved through his days like a shadow. He chopped wood, fed his lone horse, and melted snow for water. His hands, gnarled and strong, remembered tasks even when his tongue had forgotten how to speak. Each morning, the sun rose, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink, but it never touched the quiet corners of Ezra's heart. He was a man carved from the wilderness itself, rough, unyielding, and profoundly alone. He hadn't chosen this life for its beauty, but for its distance. Distance from people, from memories, from the pain that had driven him into this solitary existence. The snow outside piled higher, covering the tracks of any creature brave enough to venture out. It was a white blanket, keeping the world at bay, just as Ezra kept his own world locked tight within himself. The quiet was a comfort, a shield. He didn't know how to live without it anymore. Ezra had grown used to the everyday quiet, but the sky began to change. A deep, bruised purple spread across the western horizon, swallowing the last sliver of weak sunlight. The wind, which usually just whispered, started to howl, shaking the very bones of his cabin. This was no ordinary snowfall. A fierce blizzard was brewing. He worked quickly, securing the shutters and bringing in extra firewood. The air grew colder, and soon, flakes as big as silver dollars began to fall, swirling in a wild dance. The blizzard hit with full force, a roaring white wall that erased the world outside his windows. Snow piled against the door, drifted high against the walls, and buried his horse's small lean-to. The familiar landscape vanished under an endless sea of white. For 3 days and nights, the storm raged. Ezra stoked the fire, listened to the wind's angry cries, and felt the cabin groan under the weight of the snow. He ate his simple stores, his silence unbroken save for the crackle of the fire. The storm deepened his isolation, cutting him off from even the thought of another human being. He was alone, utterly and completely, just as he preferred. When the wind finally softened to a mournful sigh, and the snow stopped falling, Ezra looked out at a world transformed into an impossible, silent white desert. The sun, bright and cold, finally broke through the clouds, making the fresh snow sparkle like a million tiny diamonds. Ezra, after days of being trapped, began the hard work of digging himself out. He cleared a path to the woodpile, then to the stream for fresh water. The silence of the vast, white world was broken only by the scrape of his shovel and his own heavy breathing. He expected no one. So, when a soft knock echoed through the still air, Ezra froze. He hadn't heard a human sound in years, certainly not a knock on his door. He gripped his shovel, his eyes narrowing as he moved slowly toward the cabin. The knocking came again, a little louder this time. Who would be foolish enough to trek through this deep snow? He unbarred the heavy door, a sliver at a time, and peered out. Standing on his snow-drifted porch was a woman. She was wrapped in a thick wool coat, a scarf covering her hair, and her cheeks were rosy from the cold. In her gloved hands, she held a woven basket, a small white cloth peeking from its top. Her eyes, a kind blue, met his. "Mr. Kane?" she asked softly, her voice carrying on the crisp air. "I'm Sarah Miller. My husband, the preacher, passed last spring. I live a few miles north. I brought you some food after the storm." Ezra stared at her, his mind struggling to make sense of her presence. A woman. Here, at his door. The words she spoke seemed to echo strangely in his ears, words he hadn't heard directed at him in so long. His brow furrowed, a deep crease forming between his eyes. Anger, sharp and sudden, flared within him. This was his sanctuary, his quiet place, and she had dared to invade it. His throat felt dry and used to making sounds. He tried to speak, but only a rough, guttural noise escaped. It was a sound more animal than human, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate from deep within his chest. "Leave!" he rasped, the single word tearing at his throat, sounding like sandpaper. It was harsh, broken, and filled with a raw fury. He took a step forward, his tall frame looming in the doorway, hoping to scare her away. Sarah, however, did not flinch. Her kind blue eyes held steady, meeting his gaze without fear. She simply stood there, the basket clutched firmly in her hands, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. Ezra growled again, a warning, a desperate plea for her to respect his solitude. He wanted her gone, wanted his silence back, wanted the world to disappear once more. Ezra's growl hung in the cold air, a clear sign of his fury. But Sarah didn't move. She just stood there, her blue eyes looking past his anger, past the rough beard and the wild hair, as if searching for something deeper. She had seen pain before, in the eyes of her husband's flock, in the quiet despair of grieving families. This man, despite his size and his frightening sounds, seemed to carry a hurt that was just as heavy. "I won't leave," she said, her voice soft but firm, a gentle counterpoint to his harshness. "Not until I know you'll be all right. That blizzard was bad, Mr. Kane. Folks look out for each other out here." She took a small step forward, not invading his space, but showing she wouldn't be easily chased off. "This food is warm. You must be hungry." Ezra gritted his teeth, his hands clenching at his sides. He wanted to shout, to roar, to make her turn and run back the way she came. But something in her steady gaze, in the quiet strength of her stance, held him. He saw no fear in her, only a stubborn kindness. It was a kindness he hadn't seen in years, a kindness he didn't know how to fight. He stood his ground, a silent, angry statue, but he didn't close the door. Ezra stood, frozen by Sarah's refusal to leave, his anger warring with a strange, unfamiliar confusion. Just then, a sudden gust of wind swept down from the mountains, carrying a fresh flurry of snow. It wasn't another full blizzard, but enough to kick up the drifts and make the path Sarah had taken disappear under a fresh white veil. The sky, which had been bright moments before, quickly turned a heavy, ominous gray. A shiver ran through Ezra, not entirely from the cold. His head felt thick, and his bones ached more than usual. He swayed slightly, gripping the doorframe to steady himself. Sarah noticed. Her gaze, sharp and knowing, took in his flushed face and the sudden weakness in his stance. "Mr. Kane, you don't look well," she said, her voice filled with concern. "You're feverish." Before Ezra could grunt a denial, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He stumbled back into the cabin, collapsing onto his rough cot. The cabin, small and meant for one, suddenly felt crowded with the presence of another. The fresh snow outside, piling higher against the door, sealed them in. They were trapped, not just by the lingering storm, but by Ezra's sudden sickness, in the tiny space he had guarded so fiercely. Ezra lay on his cot, shivering despite the heat of the fever. His world narrowed to the rough blanket, the spinning ceiling, and the unwelcome, yet undeniably real, presence of Sarah. He felt her cool hand on his forehead, then a damp cloth gently wiping his face. Every instinct screamed at him to push her away, to regain his fierce independence. But his body was weak, betraying him. Sarah moved around the small cabin with quiet purpose. She found his meager supply of dried herbs and brewed a bitter tea. She checked his fire, making sure it wouldn't go out. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand anything, just cared for him with a calm, steady grace. Ezra, in his feverish haze, could only grunt or shift restlessly. His silence, once a choice, was now forced upon him by his illness, and his self-reliance, once his proudest trait, had crumbled. He was a man who had faced the wilderness alone for years, but now he couldn't even fetch his own water. The simple act of needing another person, of having someone else do for him, was a bitter pill. Yet a part of him, a very small, deeply buried part, recognized the comfort in her gentle care. The smell of her herbal tea, the sound of her soft movements, were unfamiliar, but not entirely unwelcome. The fever raged, pulling Ezra into a restless sleep filled with shadows and whispers. Sarah sat by his cot, changing the damp cloth on his forehead, listening to his ragged breathing. Suddenly, he stirred, his eyes still closed, and a low murmur escaped his lips. "Jessino, not your fault." Sarah leaned closer, her heart aching for the suffering man. He tossed his head, muttering again, fragments of words that painted a picture of deep sorrow. Fire, smoke, couldn't save her. His voice was hoarse, filled with a pain that years of silence had clearly failed to erase. Left, had to leave. These weren't just fevered ramblings. They were echoes of a past he had buried. Sarah understood, then, that his silence wasn't just a choice, but a heavy burden, a punishment he had dealt himself. He spoke of names, places, and a terrible event that seemed to have shattered his life. She didn't try to make sense of every word, but the raw emotion behind them was clear. He had lost someone, perhaps everything, and had run to this lonely cabin to escape the ghost that haunted him. The growl, she realized, was not just anger, but a wall built around a broken heart. Sarah didn't interrupt Ezra's fevered confessions. She just sat there, a quiet, calming presence in the small, warm cabin. When his muttering faded, she would hum a low, soft tune, a hymn she remembered from her childhood. It was a sound Ezra hadn't heard in years, a gentle melody that seemed to soothe the agitated spirits clinging to his fevered mind. She brought him sips of water and her homemade tea, holding the cup patiently as his trembling hands struggled to grasp it. When he was too weak, she would lift his head gently, letting him drink slowly. Her touch was light, respectful, never demanding. She replenished the fire, keeping the cabin cozy against the cold outside, making sure there was always a soft glow in the dim light. Ezra, even in his clouded state, felt her steady care. It was a kind of comfort he had long forgotten, a silent understanding that asked for nothing in return. He felt safe, in a way he hadn't felt since before the shadows had fallen on his life. Sarah simply existed beside him, a beacon of quiet strength. She was just there, a silent guardian in his moment of greatest weakness, a silent listener to the pain that spilled from his lips. As the fever slowly broke, a heavy sweat drenched Ezra's clothes, leaving him weak but clear-headed. He blinked, the cabin no longer spinning, and his eyes met Sarah's across the small space. The initial shock of her presence returned, but it was softer now, tinged with a grudging awareness of her care. He remembered the growls, his harsh words, and felt a flicker of shame. The raw anger that had greeted her was gone, replaced by an awkward silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence he cherished, but a new, uneasy quiet that filled the cabin. Sarah no longer moved with the urgency of a caregiver, but with a quiet respect for his returning strength. She sat by the fire, mending a tear in her coat, her presence a constant, yet unspoken, question. Ezra pushed himself up, his muscles stiff and sore. He caught her eye, and instead of the furious glare he might have offered days ago, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a sign. A signal that the fight had gone out of him, replaced by a quiet acceptance of their shared space. The tension hadn't vanished completely, but it had softened, like ice melting into cold water, creating a fragile, unspoken truce between them. The truce held, a fragile peace in the small cabin. Sarah, with her gentle wisdom, didn't push Ezra, but she didn't shy away either. She knew his silence was a heavy wall, but she also knew the man behind it had spoken in his fever. One afternoon, as she stirred a pot of thin stew, she spoke, her voice soft and clear. "The snow is deep. It'll be a few more days before anyone can travel safely." Ezra grunted, a noncommittal sound, staring into the fire. "Do you have enough wood, Mr. Kane?" she asked, not looking at him directly, but letting the question hang in the air. "I saw your pile was getting low before the last flurry." He paused, then slowly, reluctantly, nodded. It was a small movement, but it was an answer. Sarah smiled faintly. "Good. We wouldn't want to get cold now, would we? She continued to stir. Then, your horse, is he well sheltered? This time, Ezra took a breath, a sound that seemed to catch in his chest. His gaze was fixed on the fire, but his jaw worked. Finally, a single, raspy word emerged. Warm. It was rough, barely a whisper, but it was a word. It was the first word he had spoken in 5 years, directed not in anger, but in response, a tiny crack in the great wall of his silence. Sarah's heart gave a little jump, but she simply nodded, her expression unchanged. That's good to hear, Mr. Kane. Very good. After the single word, warm, a new kind of silence settled. It wasn't the heavy, impenetrable quiet of before, but one filled with unspoken questions and possibilities. Ezra felt the word on his tongue, a strange, rough taste after so many years. It was both frightening and freeing. Sarah continued to speak in her soft, calm way, talking about the weather, the dwindling food in her basket, and the tasks she was doing around the cabin. She gave him space, but her presence was a gentle invitation. Each time she paused, Ezra felt the pressure to respond, a new ache in his chest that wasn't from the fever. One morning, as Sarah poured him a cup of coffee, she remarked, "The drifts are still high. Might need to dig out the south side if we want more sunlight." Ezra looked at the window, then back at the coffee. He cleared his throat, a painful, rusty sound. Too deep, he managed, his voice still rough, like stones grinding together. It was only 2 words, but it was a sentence of full thought. He tested the sound, the way it felt to push the air past his vocal cords. He felt a small tremor, a ripple of fear, but also a tiny spark of something else, relief. Sarah nodded, a small, encouraging smile on her lips. Perhaps, but the sun feels good, doesn't it? Ezra rasped, looking out. Good. He spoke it almost to himself, the word tasting like a promise. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. They shared simple meals, often just Sarah's stew or Ezra's dried meat, sitting across from each other at the small wooden table. Ezra no longer growled, and sometimes he would offer a single word or a short phrase in response to Sarah's soft questions. His voice was still rough, but it was there, a quiet testament to her patience. One afternoon, a patch of sunlight streamed through the window, making the dust motes dance. Sarah paused her mending to watch the snow outside, which still sparkled under the winter sun. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured, not expecting a reply. Ezra, who had been whittling a piece of wood, stopped. He looked out at the vast, white expanse, something he had seen countless times. But this time, with Sarah beside him, it felt different. Cold, he grunted, but without his usual harshness. Still cold. Sarah chuckled softly. Yes, but bright. A good day to be inside. He nodded, a flicker of something almost like agreement in his eyes. Later, as dusk settled, they watched the pale moonlight paint the snow in silver. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the gentle crackle of the fire, the soft sounds of Sarah's movements, and the unspoken comfort of 2 people simply being together. Ezra found himself not just tolerating her presence, but finding a quiet solace in it. The quiet comfort they found together slowly chipped away at Ezra's tightly held secrets. One evening, as the fire crackled, casting long shadows, Sarah asked, "You mentioned a fire when you were sick. A Jessie?" Her voice was soft, inviting, not prying. Ezra stiffened, his eyes fixed on the flames. The memory was a raw wound, one he hadn't touched in years. But Sarah's presence, her steady kindness, felt like a balm. He took a deep, shaky breath, the words tasting like ash. "My wife," he rasped, the confession a painful release. "And daughter." Jessie was her name. He paused, struggling with the weight of the past. "Farm. Fire took it. Took them. My fault." His voice cracked on the last 2 words, a deep, guttural sound of agony. "Couldn't save them. Nothing left. So I left." He gestured vaguely to the cabin, the mountains, his isolated life. "Came here. To be alone. To forget." Sarah listened, her expression full of quiet sorrow. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply let him speak, letting the painful story spill out into the warm, quiet space of the cabin. It was the first time he had ever truly spoken of it, the first time the reasons for his silence were laid bare. After Ezra finished speaking, the cabin was silent once more, but it was a different kind of quiet now, heavy with shared understanding. Sarah reached out, gently touching his arm. "I know loss, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband, Thomas, he was the preacher. A good man. He caught the fever last spring, after helping a family in the valley. There was nothing I could do." Ezra looked at her, truly seeing her sorrow for the first time, recognizing a reflection of his own. "It was hard," Sarah continued, her gaze distant. "So hard to wake up each morning, and he wasn't there. The world felt empty. I thought I would just fade away with grief." She paused, her fingers tracing the rough wood of the table. "But then I remembered his words. He always said, even in the darkest night, there is a star." I had to keep going. For him, for myself. I had to find my own light again. She looked at Ezra, her blue eyes clear and strong. "It doesn't make the pain go away, not truly. But it makes it bearable. It lets you live again, even with the scars." Her story, spoken with quiet strength, was not a demand for him to feel better, but a simple offering of shared experience, a bridge built between their two wounded hearts. The air in the cabin, once thick with Ezra's silent pain, now held a new, softer quality. Sarah's story had done more than just share her grief. It had built a bridge. Ezra looked at her differently now, seeing not just the kind woman who had cared for him, but a fellow traveler on a path of sorrow, yet one who had found a way to carry on. He saw strength, not just kindness. His own words, raw and stumbling, had opened a door he thought was forever locked. Sarah's understanding, her lack of judgment, was like a gentle thaw. The ice around his heart, thick and unyielding for years, began to crack, allowing tiny rivulets of warmth to seep in. He found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a quiet curiosity, a dawning respect. They still didn't talk much, but the silence between them was no longer a barrier. It was a space where unspoken understanding bloomed. He would sometimes catch her eye, and a small, almost imperceptible nod would pass between them, a shared recognition of their shared burdens and a quiet hope that lay beneath. The emotional cold that had defined Ezra's world was slowly, gently, giving way to a fragile, budding warmth. The bitter grip of winter was slowly loosening. The sun climbed higher each day, and drips of water could be heard from the eaves, signaling the slow melt. Outside the cabin, the snow, once a towering barrier, began to recede, revealing patches of dark earth and the tips of pine needles. The world was waking up, and with its awakening came a new, uneasy feeling inside the cabin. Sarah pointed to a robin that landed on a snow-covered branch outside the window. "Spring is coming, Ezra," she said, her voice soft, but with an underlying note of something that made him feel hollow. "The paths will be clear soon." Ezra grunted, turning back to the fire. He knew what that meant. Her departure, the thought, once a welcome prospect, now brought a strange tightness to his chest. The cabin, which had felt too small with her presence, suddenly seemed vast and empty at the idea of her leaving. The quiet he had once craved now felt like a lonely echo. A new tension settled between them, different from the initial anger, but just as potent. It was the unspoken awareness that their time together was drawing to a close. Sarah began to gather her few belongings, folding her shawl, checking her worn boots. Each movement was a quiet reminder that the wilderness outside, once their prison, would soon become her road home. Ezra watched Sarah prepare for her departure, each careful movement a stab of unease. The thought of her leaving, of returning to his absolute solitude, filled him with a dread he hadn't known he could feel. He had spent years building a fortress around himself, brick by silent brick, but Sarah had, without trying, walked right through it. He thought of the early days, his growls, his fierce desire for her to be gone. Now, the memory felt distant, like a bad dream. Her presence had filled the cabin with something he hadn't realized he was missing. quiet companionship, a gentle understanding, the simple sound of another human breathing. He had even started speaking, words that now felt less like a chore and more like a bridge. Being alone again wouldn't be the same. The silence would no longer be a shield, but a hollow space where her voice used to be. The warmth in his chest, the faint glow that had begun to melt the years of ice, would surely freeze over again. He saw himself, a gaunt shadow in the quiet cabin, and the image was bleak. Sarah's coming had broken his routine of self-reliance. Yes, but it had also shown him a life beyond his self-made prison. He was changed, irrevocably so, and the thought of going back to the old Ezra was unbearable. Sarah felt Ezra's eyes on her as she packed, a silent, heavy gaze. She had seen the change in him, a slow blossoming from hardened, silent man to someone capable of quiet words and shared sorrow. The growl was gone, replaced by a deep vulnerability that tugged at her heart. She had come to help a stranger, but she was leaving a man she had come to care for. Her own cabin, a few miles north, suddenly felt less like home and more like an empty space. The thought of returning to its quiet solitude, after the unexpected warmth of this shared time, brought a pang of sadness. She had faced her own grief, found her own strength, but the connection she had forged with Ezra was something new, something she hadn't expected to find again. She paused, holding a small, worn Bible in her hands. She had come to Montana seeking a new beginning after Thomas's death, but she hadn't known what that beginning would look like. Now, looking at Ezra, at the quiet hope that had flickered in his eyes when he spoke of his past, she felt a strong pull to stay. A warmth, gentle but insistent, had grown in her heart for this gruff, wounded man. Leaving felt wrong, like abandoning a fragile shoot in the snow. Sarah zipped her travel bag shut, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. She turned to face Ezra, her heart heavy with the unspoken farewell. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the thawing landscape. The moment stretched, thick with emotion. Then Ezra turned. His eyes, usually guarded, were open, vulnerable, reflecting a desperate plea. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another. His throat worked, and he took a deep, shuddering breath, gathering all his courage. "Sarah," he rasped, her name a fragile sound on his lips, a testament to his broken silence. He reached out a hand, not quite touching her, but offering it. "Don't go," he managed, the words a raw whisper. "Stay." His gaze was intense, pleading. "Stay here, with me." It was more than an invitation to share his cabin. It was an offering of his fractured life, his slowly mending heart. He was laying bare his deepest fear and his greatest hope. He had spent 5 years running from the world, from connection, but now he was asking for it, with all the raw sincerity he possessed. The growl was truly gone, replaced by a desperate, hopeful plea. Sarah looked at Ezra, at the hand he held out, and at the raw hope shining in his eyes. Her own heart, which had felt empty for so long, swelled with a warmth that chased away the last traces of winter's chill. She saw not just a broken man, but a man brave enough to ask for help, to open his heart after years of pain. She took his hand, her fingers closing gently around his calloused ones. "Yes, Ezra," she said, her voice soft but clear, full of a quiet certainty. "I'll stay." A wave of relief washed over Ezra, making his knees weak. The tension that had coiled in his chest for days finally loosened, leaving him feeling lighter than he had in years. He didn't know what the future held, but with Sarah beside him, the prospect of it no longer filled him with dread. They stood there, hands clasped, watching the last of the snow melt from the cabin roof. The wilderness outside was still cold, still vast, but inside, a new warmth had taken root. It was a warmth built on shared sorrow and new hope, a quiet promise of a life together. Ezra, once lost in silence, had found his voice, and in doing so, had found a companion to share the long, thawing days ahead. Sarah, the preacher's widow, had found the man behind the growl, and in him, a new beginning.